gone through 11 chapters of Romans, the book of Romans, and now we are in what chapter? Chapter 12, right? That's right. So I want to talk to you about this. How many of you know anything about basketball? How about college basketball? Have you ever heard of Duke University? They seem to be one of the best college basketball teams that's ever existed. My brother went to Duke University. My brother's getting older. He's in his late 60s now. It's shocking to me. But he still is a Duke fanatic. And they're often in the Final Four of college basketball. They often win the whole Megillah, the whole ball of wax, as they say. They're definitely one of the best college basketball teams that have ever existed. The coach, they call him Coach K because nobody can pronounce his last name, understands how his players work, and he knows a lot about how to motivate them to do their very best. Moreover, Coach K concentrates on their character at least as much as their competence as a basketball player. He believes that that will affect their ability to play a great game together. If you've ever watched a Duke game in person or on television, you'll see athletes performing to their max, but they always are mindful that they're not just individuals, they're a team, and that sometimes, instead of taking that long, beautiful shot, they have to pass the ball to a teammate who can easily do a layup. In other words, they're willing to sacrifice their own glory for the sake of their team. The players are disciplined from having their bodies in great shape. There's no fat players playing professional basketball or college basketball, especially on Duke. And they have their attitudes also trimmed and in line. They win because they recognize, as it says in sports, there is no I in team. They understand about cooperation. The great rabbi from Tarsus, Paul the Apostle, also known as Shaul the Shaliach, sent one, is on a roll. He has presented a wealth of vital information to the Romans, and now he says some more things to them and to us. He starts out in Romans 12, verse 1, I exhort you, therefore. I want to discuss that one verse for a moment. It is a hinge verse. When you see the word therefore, you always have to say to yourself, what is therefore? And in this case, it's a hinge verse between what came before and what is coming after. A hinge like on a door. Have you ever looked at how a door opens? It's got a hinge. It connects it to the wall. And that's what enables it to move from one place to the other. It's like that with a hinge verse in Scripture. Here, this hinge verse tells us we need to take a look at what came before we even continue to know what happens next. It's a hinge verse that connects Rav Shaul's thoughts. Now, what came before was Rabbi Shaul's doctrinal exposition and explanation of sin and of the need and method for salvation. All have sinned and come short of God's glory, says the apostle. Nobody is where they need to be. Remember, at the beginning of this letter that's called Romans, he expressed what I would call his motto. This is his motto. He says, for I am not ashamed of the good news, for it is of the Messiah, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, to the Jews especially, and also to the non-Jews. That's his modus operandi in life, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. Every place he went in the book of Acts, all the little cities he went to, he always went to the Jew first by going to a synagogue. This was his his reason for being, but he knew if he went to the Jews first, he would win many non-Jews as well. That seems to be God's plan for world evangelization. Now, applying this motto in chapters 2 through 8, he explains how the Torah is to be understood in relationship to the good news. He continues in chapter 9 explaining his very heavy burden for his people. He says, I am speaking the truth as one who belongs to the Messiah. I don't lie. And also bearing me witness is my conscience governed by the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. My grief is so great, the pain in my heart so constant, that I could wish myself actually under God's curse and separated from the Messiah if it would help my brothers, my own flesh and blood, the people of Israel. Like Moses, Paul was willing to give up his own salvation for the people of Israel. Hard to imagine anybody being willing to say that, but he did. He explains in chapter 10 his heartfelt pain for his people, and then in Romans 10 he explains what's going to happen. In chapter 9 he explains his grief. In chapter 10 he says, brothers, my heart's deepest desire and my prayer to God for Israel is for their salvation. For I can testify to their zeal for God, but it is not based on correct understanding. For since they are unaware of God's way of making people righteous, and instead seek to set up their own, they have not submitted themselves to God's way of making people righteous. A couple weeks ago I shared with you that I admire and love the Orthodox Jews that I've met in my life in Baltimore and otherwise. Their zeal for God is unmatched by any Christian I've ever seen, except maybe a Billy Graham or somebody who sacrificed their life. Their zeal is amazing, but according to Paul, it's not according to full understanding of God's method. Then in Romans 11, he describes how God is going to reach this people. I shared this with you last week, first reminding his readers that God has not totally repudiated or rejected his people whom he knew before. There's still a remnant in his day, just like there was in Elijah's day, when Elijah said to God, hey, it's me, I'm out here by myself in the wilderness, nobody cares about you but me. Elijah had just had a spiritual victory on the top of Mount Carmel on the western part of Israel, where he single-handedly, with God's help, defeated the prophets of Baal, and was so excited about it that in the rain he ran many, many miles and was exhausted, and he finally collapsed and said, God, I'm so tired. I let you down. I was afraid of Jezebel, the queen of the Baal worshipers, and she scared me, and I failed you, God. Take my life. Elijah felt like he was all alone. Paul references that in Romans 11 by saying it's still the same in this day, where of his day, that Paul is not the only person who is standing with God. He's part of a larger remnant. In Elijah's day, the remnant was 7,000. It gives that number. In Paul's day, we don't know, maybe 1 million. In our day, I have no idea, but I would say there's at least 1 million Jewish people who believe in Yeshua around the world. Maybe they're not all in Messianic congregations. I know they're not. Most of these people go to churches. They attend churches because that's where they met the Messiah, or that's where they feel comfortable, and that's fine. Personally, I wish they would get involved in Messianic Judaism, but that may not happen for a while. But there's at least 1 million followers of the Messiah in this day and age too. The remnant still exists. It's the remnant. There's 18 million Jews in the world, 68 to 18 million Jews in the world. 1 million is a small number. compared to 60 million. You might call it a remnant. It still exists in our day. And now that Paul has explained this whole idea about a remnant and how God is working with the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people, he closes Romans 11 with a praise, with a doxology. He says, for who has known, He says, oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How inscrutable, how unknowable are his judgments, how unsearchable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Who has been his counselor? Or who has given him anything and made him pay it back? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever.
Amen.
Amen, right? That's Paul's praise at the end of Romans 11. I think he got so excited about what he had just written, he had to just stop and praise God for who God is and what he was doing. Remember, Romans 11 describes how God is going to reach his own Jewish people through Gentiles. I've heard Gentiles, Christians say to me, I don't know why God would save me. I was a terrible person. But God reached out and saved me, and they said, I have no idea why I'm saved. I said, I'll give you an idea. Romans 11:11 says, you're supposed to provoke my people to jealousy for the Messiah. That's not the only reason God saves Gentiles, but it certainly is one of them, according to Paul. So he gives this doxology, this praise, and then he goes on and says a few other things. He's done with the theological section, and now he's going to give us some practical challenges to the Romans, and of course to us by extension. Romans 12, verse 1. I exhort you, therefore, brothers, in view of God's mercies, to offer yourself as a sacrifice. By the way, in these days, everybody saw physical sacrifices at least twice a day in the temple. If they were ever anywhere in Jerusalem, they heard the sacrifices, they saw the sacrifices, they might have smelled the sacrifices. Sacrifices of animals were commonplace in those days. So Paul, picking up on that, says to these people he's writing in Rome, present yourselves as sacrifices. But he doesn't mean commit suicide or go put yourself on a fire. No, he says you need to sacrifice your lives. Not your living, but your lives. Everything is to be sacrificed unto the Lord. Living and set apart for God. This will please him, Paul writes. It is the logical temple worship for you. So the sacrifices of the believers, it's not our bodies necessarily, it's ourselves. We're called to sacrifice. I think it's a practice would be for every morning for us to wake up and say, God, how can I sacrifice for you today? What a change in our attitude that would bring. God, how can I sacrifice for you today? He goes on, he says, instead, keep letting yourselves be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you will know what God wants and will agree that what he wants is good, satisfying, and able to succeed. In other words, allow yourselves to be transformed. Allow your mind to be transformed, to be changed as you are in a relationship with Yeshua. What does God want? What does God want? He wants us to be spiritually, mentally, physically, and emotionally healthy. Our loving Father in heaven only wants good for us, despite what we may think sometimes when God doesn't seem to be answering our prayers. I know he doesn't work on our timetable, does he? He works on his timetable. The challenge in our lives is to get on his timetable. We'll be happier people. We recall the words of Jeremiah, who said, for I know what plans I have in mind for you, says Adonai, plans for well-being, not for bad things, so that you can have hope, and a future. Jeremiah picks up on this idea that God is not here to make us miserable. God is here to make us happy, make us complete, make us fulfilled, make us healthy, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and physically. God wants good for us. So Yirmiyahu foreshadowed those words of Paul. This is especially true, my friends, for those of us who have been made children of God by the work of our elder brother, Yeshua HaMashiach. Keep in mind, we all are chosen people in him. Some of us, the Messianic Jews, have been really twice chosen. We were chosen by God to be Jews in the first place. We didn't do anything about that. That happened because of our genealogies. But we've been chosen by God also to be his children in the Messiah. Twice chosen. Well, Romans 12, 1 through 11 speaks of the mercies of God, the great sacrifices and gifts given to us. That's why we can be asked to refuse to be conformed to this world. Paul says, be transformed in your mind. Don't be conformed to this world. This world is called the Olam Hazeh. So we can be transformed through a renewed mind and be in the Olam Haba, the world to come. We have an incredible situation, my friends. Don't freak out. You're living in two worlds. You're living right here in the Olam Hazeh, this world, yet you have a firm foothold in the Olam Haba, the world to come. What if we thought about that every morning? After we ask God how we can sacrifice for him today, we remember the fact that we have been called to live in this world, but not be conformed to it, but be transformed, because we're going to be living in the Olam Hazeh, that world, the world to come. The Bible speaks of it. Fascinating idea. So he said, I exhort you therefore, brothers, in view of God's mercies, to offer yourselves as a sacrifice, living and set apart for God. This will please him. It is your logical temple worship. In other words, do not let yourselves be conformed to the standards of the Olam Hazeh, for I'm telling every single one of you through the grace that has been given to me not to have exaggerated ideas about your own importance. This is the first practical advice he's giving here. Don't have any exaggerated ideas about your own importance. Instead, develop a sober estimate of yourself based on the standard which God has given to each one of you, namely trust, namely faith. I think it's interesting that he starts out this whole section on advice and recommendations and practical applications of his theology, is saying, don't be overly confident about who you are or how important you are. Is it possible that those people who are conformed to the standards of this world can become prideful, can become cocky, arrogant, thinking themselves better than they really are? Is that possible? I think it's probable. I think all of us think that we're really the cat's meow, as they used to say. Now, we are special because we're loved by God, and we do have certain talents and gifts that he gives us, and we should enjoy them and feel good about ourselves that we apply them. But we're still far from where we need to be. We need to learn how to check ourselves out every morning when we begin our day. And that way, that's one of the ways to grow. We have to be also realistically humble, not falsely humble. I don't like when you give somebody a compliment about something they did and they say, oh, it wasn't me at all, it was God. Well, yes and no, but we are allowed to feel good about what we do, what we accomplish. That's a good thing. We don't have to be self-deprecating, but we don't want to be self-aggrandizing either, overly cocky either. We have to walk a fine line between how much we value who we are and how much we appreciate God for making us that way. Verse 4. Here, and he's going on to another concept here. For just as there are many parts that compose one body, but the parts don't all have the same function, so there are many of us, and in union with the Messiah, we comprise one body, with each of us belonging to the others. Once again, it's a pitch for partnerships. He's urging the members of this congregation in Rome, the Jews and Gentiles, to recognize they're parts of the same body. In this case, whether they're Jewish or Gentile. He also, elsewhere, talks about whether they're men or women, But I'm saying that he's really going beyond that. He's saying, whatever you've been given, it's a gift from God, and use it for him. We're all part of the same body, and guess what? God gives local congregations all that they need to function well. I totally believe that. It's very scriptural. God puts things in our congregations, gives people talents and gifts in congregations for the purpose of the congregation survival. Paul is speaking against the kind of behavior that's all too common in the body, where people don't recognize that they're really connected. I want to point something out to you, my friends. Some of you have been around Emmanuel for a long, long time. And I know some of you, particularly my friend Steve, my friend Rusty, have been through Emmanuel through a lot of ups and downs. But they've stuck it out. I so much commend people that don't just say, oh, I don't like what he said, or that bothers me, or she didn't do enough in the cleanup, or whatever the reason, I'm leaving. That's not a mature way to be. For example, if you live in a neighborhood and you've lived there for a while and now you're moving, do you just pack your house and leave, or do you maybe say goodbye to your next door neighbors? What's amazing in the body of the Messiah is what people do is they just leave. It's like they don't recognize, and it's a shame, they don't recognize that we are a family. We're a community. We're connected by the Spirit of God. And to just pick up and walk out because you're upset about something is not a mature way to behave. A neighbor who does that is not looked upon in the future with much appreciation. We need to remember that we're a community, we're one body, albeit smaller than other bodies, and we are connected to one another. That way we'll grow together. Verse 6, but we have gifts that differ and which are meant to be used according to the grace that has been given to us. Here's a list of the gifts. I'm not going to go into too many of the details here because it's pretty self-explanatory. And I want to go somewhere else with this. I've talked about the gifts that God gives us at other times. He said, if our gift is serving, if we have a gift of serving, serve. If God gives you the gift of being a servant person, do it. If you are gifted to teach, teach. Because the gift didn't come from you, it came from God. He's saying, activate your gift. Activate the gift God gives you. If you're a counselor type, use your gift to comfort and exhort other people. If you are someone who gives, do it simply and generously. If you are in a position of leadership, lead with diligence and zeal. If you're one who does acts of mercy, do them cheerfully. In other words, these are gifts that God gives our community, and we all need to activate our gifts and do them for the sake of everybody else. There are no I's in team, remember? Duke would never be what it is if they didn't have great teamwork. God is asking our congregation to have teamwork. Paul also writes in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 about the same idea of having many gifts in the body and to use them for the congregation. It's a challenge that everybody needs to accept. God puts people together to accomplish something for him. I want to say that again. God puts us together to accomplish something for him. We're a team, if you will. God puts us together as a team to accomplish something for him, for his purpose. If we don't exercise the gifts he has given us in our team will not do very well. Can you imagine in sports, if the Duke players, and in basketball, I don't know much about basketball, I'm too short and I can't jump, but I like watching the game. But in basketball, you have usually a tall center, a couple of forwards, and a couple of guards. Am I right? Isn't that right? Right. That's pretty much the team. And each person has a specific role on a given play. Sometimes the center gets to be in the center and gets to jump up and dunk the ball. But now everybody can dunk the ball because people have gotten taller since basketball began. So even the guards can come in and dunk the ball. You know what dunk the ball means? Jump up and just drop it in the basket. Am I talking a foreign language to some of you?
Yeah.
I am, I'm sorry. Basketball, you know? Okay. I usually use golf as an illustration. I thought, no, I'll use something different today. Should have stuck with golf, I think. Anyway, it's a game. And you bounce the ball and you throw it in a basket. Basketball, right? But it's played with energy, with coordination, and great teamwork. Well, sometimes in basketball, your role, maybe you're the center, maybe you're the forward, maybe you're the guard, you can't get to your position, so somebody else fills in. They don't think anything of it because it's teamwork. Same in a congregation. We all have our respective roles, but if we can't get our roles done for some reason, somebody else needs to step in and not make a big deal out of it, just to get the teamwork done that God has given our team. I believe that that really pleases him. So speaking of sports, and I'll just kind of get away from sports here. There's an expression in sports that I think needs to apply to all congregations, not just Emmanuel, but all congregations around the world. Quitters never win, and winners never quit. People that quit congregations for not a really good reason never win. I've seen it many, many times. People quit a congregation because they know that there's a better congregation down the street. They go to that congregation for a while, and they realize that that congregation is imperfect too, because they're perfect. So they can't be in an imperfect congregation, so they go somewhere else where it's more perfect. Well, I got an expression, a message for you, insight. You know the expression, the grass is greener on the other side? The grass is always green. It may be, but you're seeing it from a distance, and guess what the grass is made up of? Crabgrass and weeds too. You just can't see them. Every congregation has crabgrass and weeds and fallacies and faults. Everyone. Because we're not in the world to come yet. But a quitter who quits one congregation to go to another because he can't deal or she can't deal with this congregation where she is or he is for a time, never does well. Because there's always going to be something wrong. Maybe it lasts 6 months, a year, but then there'll be something wrong. So just something to remember from the world of sports. All the players on Coach K's teams know their primary position, guard, forward, or center. I'm sorry for those of you who don't know basketball. I'll talk baseball soon because it's baseball season. How's that? Same concepts. But Coach K's players all know their positions well, but they fill in when one of their teammates is out of place. Healthy congregations are like that too. Now I'm going to read the rest of the chapter and not comment on any of the verses because they're very self-explanatory, and I want you to know something. Paul writes these verses in couplets. Each verse has 2 sections that are reinforcing of one another, just like the book of Proverbs, and I'm sure Paul may have gotten that idea from the book of Proverbs. So verse 9 he says, don't let love be a mere outward show. Do I have to comment on that, or is that pretty obvious? You know, that's what I'm not going to comment. Don't let love be an outward show. Recoil from what is evil and cling to what is good. Love each other devotedly with brotherly love and set examples for each other in showing respect. Don't be lazy when hard work is needed, but serve the Lord with spiritual fervor. Rejoice in your hope. Be patient in your troubles and continue steadfastly in prayer. Share what you have with God's people and practice hospitality. Bless those that persecute you. Bless them, don't curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be sensitive to each other's needs. Don't think of yourselves better than others, but make humble people your friends. Don't be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but try to do what everyone regards as good. If possible, and to the extent that it depends on you, live in peace with all people. Never seek revenge, my friends. Instead, leave that to God. For in the Tanakh it is written, Adonai says, vengeance is my responsibility. I will repay. On the contrary, he goes on, if your enemy is hungry, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap fiery coals of shame on his head. Last part of this section, he says, do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. There's nothing in that list that needs great explanation. What it needs is acceptance. When we read that list of admonitions from Rav Shaul, that list of challenges for how to change our lives for the better, how to make our congregation stronger and healthier, it just needs to be done. Not even talked about, but just done. So in conclusion, I want to talk about something a little different. It relates. I promise you it relates. You're going to think I went off the deep end. But not for long. Let's talk about cells, shall we? Not sales, but cells. The building blocks of life, which make up an organism. Do you know that your body has trillions of cells in it? I'm not talking thousands, I'm not talking millions, I'm not talking billions, I'm talking trillions of cells in it. The human body is phenomenal. It's made up of trillions of cells. Maybe some of our bodies have a few more cells because we're bigger, but trillions of cells. That's the way the Creator made us. Likewise, congregations are constituted by cells in a sense as well, each made with its own purpose. Every one of those trillions of cells in our body is programmed to behave a certain way by the DNA in the nucleus. If there's any biologists here, please don't correct me until we're done. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a zoologist, but I think this is accurate because I looked. But I think I'm making this case that the cells in our bodies each have a certain function. Do you know when we're born, when we are conceived and we grow in our mother's wombs as a, quote, fetus for a while, we don't have any sex. We're still not male or female. That happens down the road a little bit when certain cells read their DNA and say, oh, I'm supposed to be a woman, or I'm supposed to be a man, and they develop those things. Cells have DNA, and it's the DNA that's the place where all the information, past, present, and future for that cell exists. DNA is long strands of material that are the repository of all the knowledge of that cell. They are the instruction manuals for the life of that body, the blueprint for the construction of a living creature. All that's needed is one cell and about a meter of DNA, and you could have a person if the spark of life was present. All you need is one cell with about a meter's worth of DNA and the spark of life, and you could have a person. You know, they're trying to create this in a laboratory, but so far they really haven't succeeded giving it the honest-to-God spark of life, because that comes from above. I rue the day when science has gotten so advanced that it can create people through an electrical shock, not through the Spirit of God. I don't know what the world will look like then, but it might not be as far away as we think. You see, the DNA determines what the end of the process will be. Most cells, by the way, follow their own sets of rules. Some cells become fingers, some cells become toes, some cells become eyes, some cells become ears. They all work together for the good of the organism. That's why I have hand. Some of my cells got the message from their DNA. I got to go make a hand for Rabbi Reuben. So I had cells made 2 hands, and cells that made ears and eyes. They read their DNA, and that's what happened. This is beyond my comprehension. But most cells follow their own rules and become what they're supposed to become. And when they're working together, you have a very healthy organism, whether it's a human being or a monkey. However, certain cells misbehave and lead to death. Cancer cells are antisocial cells that won't obey the rules and won't stop growing, grabbing more than their share of the space, more of their share of the food, more of their share of the blood. Cancer cells. They're traitor cells that threaten their fellow cells and the entire organism by starving out and smothering normal cells. That's the problem with cancer cells. They don't behave. They don't behave like nice, normal cells. Cells are obedient. Cells are noble, perpetually hardworking, devoted to the health and survival of the organism that they're in. But cancer cells destroy the teamwork of normal cells, and this causes chaos in the body. I think everybody knows enough about cancer. We hear about it a lot. Maybe some of you have cancer. I've had cancer 2 times. Thank God I survived. Maybe some of you have lost people to cancer. It's an awful disease. All it is that some cells go haywire and they stop reading their own DNA. The rebellious cells. Folks, this also describes human societies, particularly congregational communities. Members, let's call them cells, step into the roles they have been programmed through their DNA to take, and in the congregational life, programmed by the Holy Spirit to take. Whatever gifts and talent God gives you comes from above, right? Comes from God's Spirit. The human body, like God's Spirit, functions well when each cell assumes its called role. But cancer cells throw everything off. They don't follow the rules of the body. They follow their own rules. Their DNA is damaged, so they distort everything and destroy what the body is doing. Cancer cells. Let us allow this description to guide our growth as a congregation, so we're not conformed to the ways of this world, but are transformed into the glorious ways of God. Romans 12 establishes this concept that we might give heed to as we allow our congregation to grow under God's grace. Now, no one here is a cancer cell. I want you to know that. I'm not thinking, who's the cancer cell in a man? I'm not thinking that way. But I'll say to you, some of us may not be activating our calling that the spiritual DNA has given to us by God's Spirit. Do we know what we're called to do? I mean, everybody's called to serve. Don't we know that? That's a gift, because some people are called to serve even more than others, but everybody is called to serve in some way. It's not that hard to figure out. So let's do it. And some of us are called to do other things for the body. I would just say that Paul's message to them and to us is do it. We in this community need everybody to step up and do what God has called us to do. Let us then think about these things pertaining to the DNA of cells and how it applies to God's Spirit in each one of us. Are we following God's Spirit in our lives, or are we not listening to the DNA that God gave us by His Spirit? Ask yourself that question. Chapter 13, in which Paul offers more practical advice and tips on how to live in a society that has a government, we're going to look at next week. Now, it's going to be a little challenging for some of us, because right now we're in a pre-election period, and I know there's a lot of, shall we say, issues going on. Every time I look at the television, I'm hearing about somebody saying something. It's a crazy time, and it will be for a good long while. Well, next chapter gives us some thoughts about how to live in a society that it does have a government, because we are in an election season and we have to get our heads in shape for that. So I hope this idea about us being an organism, not just a congregation, but an organism, a living organism, and each of us is a different cell with a different DNA in us by God's Spirit, has meaning. I hope each one of us will step into our role, activate our calling, and we'll feel great about doing it, and it'll improve the entire congregational community. May God help us do that. And now please stand for Oneg. I mean, not for Oneg.